She thought he was just the help. So when she challenged him to translate a foreign note, expecting silence, he answered perfectly, and landed a job offer in front of everyone. Charleston's humidity didn't care if your linen suit cost $3,000 or $300. It clung to everyone the same way. Inside the brick and glass atrium of the Bel Air Club, though, everything was polished to perfection. The air was cool, scented faintly with bergamot and citrus, and the hush of moneyed voices filled the space like white noise. Astrid Penbrook, founder and CEO of a blockchain security firm called Nexora, had claimed her spot at one of the long outdoor tables under a cream-colored parasol. Her watch, a platinum Nomos, caught the light every time she lifted her arm to brush her silvery blonde bob away from her face. Everything about her was calculated, her confidence, her posture, even her fake laugh. Around her sat a curated blend of tech venture capitalists, 2 logistics CEOs, and a crypto influencer with suspiciously perfect teeth. They weren't here to enjoy the crab toast and blood orange mimosas. They were here to size each other up. Astrid played the room like a well-rehearsed keynote. Quick jokes, subtle jabs, the occasional story that positioned her as both brilliant and misunderstood. Meanwhile, Keon Ridley adjusted the tray against his forearm and approached her table from the side. He'd been working brunches here on Sundays for the last 7 months, ever since he'd cut his hours at the university library to focus on his thesis. His uniform shirt was slightly faded near the collar, and the dark ring around his glasses needed cleaning, but he carried himself with a stillness that made people underestimate him. "Apologies for the delay," he said calmly, as he placed Astrid's latte down in front of her. "There was a brief stall with the espresso line. I appreciate your patience." Astrid didn't look up right away. She let the silence hang long enough for everyone to notice it. Then she glanced at him with the sort of smile that wasn't really a smile, the kind that says, "You're not worth the breath it would take to respond properly." "Well, good thing you're not the one coding nuclear launch systems, huh?" she said, light enough to sound like a joke, sharp enough to sting. A few people chuckled under their breath, not at the joke, but at the power behind it. Keon gave a polite nod and turned to step away, but she wasn't done. "Wait," Astrid added, holding up her hand like she was swatting a fly. "Could you make sense of this?" She pointed at a crumpled slip of paper on the table, which had been passed to her by Dieter Wenz, a visiting fintech executive from Antwerp. "Dieter wrote this, but no one here speaks whatever this is. Dutch, maybe?" she said, grinning toward her peers. "I don't know, Keon. If you're so smart, then translate it." That got a louder laugh. Someone even muttered, "Oof," the way people do when a punch lands harder than expected. Keon looked at the paper. His expression didn't shift, didn't even flicker. "Of course," he said, with the same calm tone he'd used to explain the espresso delay. He read the note quietly to himself first, then aloud in Dutch, his pronunciation so precise that Dieter, the guest who'd written it, straightened in his chair. Keon followed with an English translation, pausing briefly to explain that a more appropriate verb would have been beggar Leiden rather than Leiden, considering the context of a cross-border data contract. No arrogance, no raised voice, just fact. The table went quiet. Dieter looked impressed. Astrid blinked a little too slowly. But Keon didn't wait around for applause. He returned the note to the table, gave a courteous nod to Dieter, and walked back toward the kitchen entrance with the same unbothered pace he'd had all morning. But something in the air had shifted, and this wasn't a crowd that missed signals like that. Astrid picked up her latte like it had personally betrayed her. She didn't sip it, just held it, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup's edge. The others at the table glanced between her and the retreating figure of Keon, their silence speaking more than words ever could. "You know," she finally said, forcing a chuckle as if she were the one in control of the moment. "I like when people surprise me. It's refreshing." But her voice was tighter than usual. She stirred the foam with her straw, trying to shrug off the discomfort, as if it were a wrinkle in her blouse. Only Dieter offered a response. "That young man," he said in his soft Belgian accent. "He knows his syntax. It's rare to hear that kind of precision, even among native speakers." Astrid smiled through her teeth. Impressive memory for a waiter, she replied, tossing her sunglasses on the table with a light clack. Still, if you're working brunch in Charleston, maybe you're not that smart after all. Dieter didn't laugh. In fact, no one did. Keon wasn't visible anymore, but it didn't matter. His absence had filled the space more than his presence had. Astrid shifted again, glancing down at her Rolex. She was already thinking about her next move, how to reassert herself, how to steer the narrative back into her hands. She leaned forward, elbows on the table. Let's pivot, she said to the group. What's everyone's take on the Florida legislation affecting data ownership? We're restructuring a piece of our infrastructure in Tallahassee, and— Sorry, Dieter interrupted, holding up a hand politely. But I'm curious. What's the name of that university again? The one he mentioned? A woman across from him, Lila Hart from Nova North Ventures, spoke up. Clark Atlanta, I think. It's a decent program. They've been publishing some solid work lately. Astrid exhaled through her nose, just enough to be heard. Sure, and I'm sure their brunch etiquette class is top tier. That one did get a few laughs, but they were softer now, unsure. Leela didn't join in. She glanced toward the kitchen door where Keon had disappeared. Astrid noticed, and that made her feel exposed. She leaned back, lifting her mimosa like a shield. Let's not pretend we're all suddenly fascinated with someone's part-time waiter. This is a business brunch, not a resume fair. But her words didn't settle the room the way they usually did. Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, Keon leaned against the stainless steel counter near the prep station, exhaling slowly through his nose. His co-worker, Santiago, raised an eyebrow from the sink. You good? Keon gave a small shrug. Yeah, just didn't think I'd be tested on Dutch syntax over lattes. Santiago chuckled. You just made Astrid Penbrook look like she Googled how to spell her own last name. Keon cracked a smile. Wasn't trying to embarrass her. Didn't look like you were trying anything. Santiago replied. That's what made it sting. Keon wiped his glasses on the hem of his apron and stared at the tile for a second. You ever get the feeling some people just walk into a room assuming they're above you? Santiago didn't answer right away. Yeah, and sometimes they are. But sometimes they just talk louder because they're hoping no one notices they don't know what the hell they're saying. Keon nodded slowly. Back at the table, Dieter had pulled out his phone and was typing something. Lila was already mentally drafting an email to someone she knew in recruitment at her firm. And Astrid? Astrid was doing math in her head, measuring how quickly the mood had shifted, how fragile perception actually was, and more than anything, how she hadn't seen it coming. But if she thought that moment had passed, she was about to be very wrong. By the time Keon returned to the patio, the tempo of the brunch had changed. The table he was serving wasn't as loud anymore. Conversation still happened, but they leaned in rather than broadcasted. Something in the rhythm had broken. He slid 2 plates onto the table without interruption. Eggs Florentine for Lila and seared salmon for the guest from Jacksonville. He turned to set down a third when Astrid caught him mid-movement. Wait a second. Keon paused, plate still in hand. His eyes met hers, not defiant, just steady. Astrid's tone was syrupy now, faux warm. What's your name again? Keon, he answered. Keon Ridley. She smiled like she was hearing it for the first time. Keon, right. So you're doing your master's, yeah? And still working tables? That's ambitious. The plate made a soft sound as it landed on the table. I do what I need to. Keon replied evenly. Astrid took a sip of her mimosa, cocked her head. And you're studying what exactly? Computational linguistics. A pause. The group listened. Wow, that's a mouthful, she said, chuckling. What, are you going to write code in French now? Keon didn't react. You know, she added, her tone light but pointed. A lot of people think knowledge is about degrees and big words. But context matters too. Like when you speak, when you stay silent, when you know your place in a room. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. Dieter frowned. Leila glanced at Astrid, then back to her napkin. One of the VC partners took a sudden interest in his water glass. Keon stayed calm. I understand context. Astrid leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the next words sting more. Then maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to flex your vocabulary over coffee. She smiled again, small and tight. This time, Keon didn't look away. If using my knowledge to answer your question respectfully is what you consider flexing, he said, then maybe you weren't asking a real question. It wasn't raised. It wasn't angry. It was just clear. Astrid's jaw stiffened. But Keon wasn't finished. I don't speak to impress. I speak to clarify. You asked me to translate. I did. You don't have to like the answer. He turned, walking toward the next table. There was a brief, breathless stillness as the others processed the moment. Astrid stared after him like she couldn't decide whether she'd just been challenged or completely disregarded. Dieter broke the silence. He didn't speak out of turn. You asked. Astrid blinked once. Slow. I know what I said. Layla placed her napkin gently on the table and reached for her phone. No one's saying you don't. Astrid opened her mouth but closed it again. And still, Keon worked. Calm, efficient. His attention now focused on an elderly couple struggling to cut into their scones. He offered assistance, fetched fresh utensils, poured their tea. His hands moved on instinct. His thoughts, however, stayed on that table behind him. In the kitchen, Santiago watched him return and leaned in. What happened? Keon didn't answer at first. He set down an empty carafe and rolled his sleeves up slightly. She told me to know my place, he finally said, barely louder than a whisper. Santiago winced. Man, Keon wiped his hands, not angrily, just methodically. I knew what this job was when I signed up, but I didn't know who I'd have to prove myself to every time I opened my mouth. Outside, Astrid tapped her spoon against her saucer. 3 sharp clicks. She thinks he made her look foolish, Layla said quietly to the man beside her. He nodded. She made herself look that way. But the real shock wasn't what Keon had said. It was what came next. Dieter finished his coffee slowly, placing the porcelain cup down with more care than necessary. He looked around the table, then back at Astrid. There was an odd stillness in his face. Not blank, not amused, just assessing. I think I'll speak to him, he said, standing up and brushing the front of his pale blue blazer. Astrid gave a tight-lipped smile. Be my guest, but her voice cracked slightly, barely noticeable. Just enough. Dieter walked toward the kitchen entrance, catching Keon just as he was stepping out with a tray of clean glasses. Pardon me, Dieter said, voice low and friendly. You mentioned Clark Atlanta. Are you currently enrolled? Keon set the tray down and nodded. Yes, final semester of my master's. Impressive, Dieter said. That paper on multilingual data tokenization, the one published under Dr. Rourke's lab, was that yours? Keon blinked. You've read that? I read everything that connects language and fintech, Dieter replied with a smile. Your section on cross-lingual parsing accuracy. It's sharp. You should know that. Keon's posture didn't change, but something in his eyes did. He wasn't used to praise like this, at least not outside academic circles. Not here. I appreciate that. Thank you, he said quietly. Dieter nodded. Do you have time to speak on Monday? Our Atlanta office could use someone with your mind. Not just for translation. Real systems thinking. Keon hesitated. Are you serious? I wouldn't waste your time, Dieter said. People spend hours at brunch saying nothing. You gave me more insight in one sentence than I've heard all week. From across the patio, Astrid was watching. Her mimosa sat untouched. Her expression was unreadable, but her grip on the glass had tightened. Keon pulled out a small notepad from his apron pocket and scribbled down his number. I'd be honored. Dieter folded the note and slipped it into his wallet. You should be leading meetings, not serving them. With that, he walked back to the table, sat down, and resumed his seat like nothing had happened, but it had. Astrid smiled at him, a flicker of tension in her eyes. Interesting conversation? Very, Dieter replied. Keon returned to work, a bit lighter in his step. Not arrogant, not gloating, just more grounded. Like something had shifted inside, and it was finally showing on the outside. At the prep station, Santiago raised an eyebrow. What was that about? Keon shrugged. He offered me a meeting. Santiago whistled. Damn, you just flipped the whole table without raising your voice. I just told the truth, Keon said. Sometimes that's enough. Back on the patio, one of the VCs leaned over to Astrid, voice lowered. He's got something, that guy. Kind of wild how sharp he is. Astrid's smile stayed frozen. Lila spoke up next. You ever think about how often we overlook people because of what they're wearing or where they're standing? Astrid looked away. He served coffee. He didn't cure cancer. No, Lila replied softly. But he carried himself better than anyone else at this table today. There it was. The pivot she couldn't control. The narrative sliding out of her hands, too slippery to grip. And as the table returned to idle chatter and passing plates, Astrid realized something. It didn't matter that she was the one with the executive suite and the market share. In this moment, the one everyone would remember wasn't her, but she wasn't going to let that memory settle without a fight. The brunch crowd had shifted. Conversations still flowed, plates clinked, and deals were whispered between bites of truffle avocado toast. But the focus had subtly drifted. Keon, without intention or theatrics, had become the person everyone now quietly registered. Not for being loud, not for posturing, but for being composed when it counted. At his table, Dieter had pulled out his phone and begun tapping out an email. A few guests at other tables had noticed the exchange, leaning over to ask, "Who is that guy?" Someone even asked one of the hostesses, who just shrugged. "He's just one of our Sunday servers. I think he's a grad student or something." But curiosity had already taken root. Astrid, meanwhile, was trying to recover ground. She flashed her signature grin, the one that had disarmed investors and silenced critics in boardrooms. She leaned toward Lila, refocusing on the latest startup rumor in Tampa. But Lila wasn't listening the way she usually did. She was watching Keon refill an older guest's water glass with quiet attention. "Did you see the way he translated that note?" she asked, cutting into Astrid's narrative. Astrid's smile flickered. "Sure, he's got a good memory. Some people do." It wasn't just memory. He corrected syntax on the fly. "That's not memory. That's understanding." Astrid waved a hand. "It's brunch. We're not handing out awards for language tricks." But the words didn't land. Lila's focus was already elsewhere. 2 tables down, a young entrepreneur who'd overheard the scene whispered to his colleague, "That guy was smoother than anyone I've seen pitch in the last month." His friend nodded. "And no fake confidence either, just real skill. It hits different when someone doesn't need to prove anything." In the kitchen, Santiago passed Keon a note someone had scribbled on a napkin. "From table 14, he said, smirking. Keon read it quietly. "If you ever want to intern at a firm that values clarity and tact, email me, J.H. He folded it carefully and tucked it in his apron pocket. Santiago clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Never seen the room bend around one person like that before," he said. Keon shook his head. "I didn't bend anything." Santiago laughed. "Yeah, that's what made it work." Back outside, Astrid was running calculations in her mind. She was used to being the draw at any table. When she spoke, people paid attention. When she cracked a joke, people laughed, whether they found it funny or not. That's how she built her presence. That's how she'd won clients, negotiated terms, and built Nexora from a laptop in a shared workspace to a firm valued at $320 million. But right now, no one was watching her. No one was laughing. "Can we please talk about the new Fed guidelines?" she said sharply, redirecting the conversation. "Later," someone mumbled. "Send it in the Slack." Astrid let the silence stretch, then stood up. "Excuse me, I need a moment." She walked away from the table without waiting for acknowledgement, her heels clicking against the flagstone with slightly more weight than usual. Her assistant, who had stayed back near the valet with Astrid's tote, looked up as she approached. "You all right?" Astrid adjusted her sunglasses, voice low. "I need to find out everything about that waiter. What's his last name?" The assistant blinked. "I think it was Ridley. Keon Ridley." Astrid's jaw worked slightly. "Get me his resume. LinkedIn. Anything. You thinking of offering him something?" "I'm thinking," she said flatly, "about controlling the story before someone else turns it into a PR moment." The assistant nodded, pulling out her phone. "I'll look into it. But even as Astrid walked back to her seat, something gnawed at her. She'd spent years making sure she was never the one being observed. Yet here she was, on the outside of a moment she hadn't authored. But Keon's calm had done something her power never could. It made people remember him. And Astrid wasn't done trying to get that spotlight back. Keon sat on a plastic crate in the back hallway, sipping a lukewarm bottle of water. The brunch rush was easing up, but the adrenaline in his chest hadn't quite settled. His phone buzzed in his apron pocket. A group text from his class cohort, someone complaining about the syntax-heavy midterm questions in Professor Hargrave's class. He smiled faintly and didn't reply. This job wasn't supposed to last more than a semester, just enough to cover rent, books, and those odd expenses no one ever talks about, like the noise-cancelling headphones that saved his sanity during all-night coding sessions, or the bus pass that got him to campus when his old Mazda's transmission failed. Clark Atlanta hadn't been his first choice, but it turned out to be the right one. He'd grown more in 2 years there than in all 4 years of undergrad. The professors didn't just grade, they challenged. And the program had pushed him to build things he didn't even know he was capable of. A language recognition model that could identify dialectical variants in refugee speech patterns. A plugin that helped teachers auto-translate basic commands for ESL students in rural schools. But people didn't see any of that when he brought their food. They saw the apron, the black slacks, the tired shoes. Not that he blamed them. Most of the time, it didn't bother him, until it did. He wasn't angry at Astrid Penbrook. Not really. What he felt was harder to name, some mix of disappointment and déjà vu. She hadn't said anything he hadn't heard before, not the words exactly, but the tone. That careful mockery, thinly disguised as humor. The way some people asked questions they didn't really want answers to. The worst part was how it chipped away at you, quietly, persistently. Like a leak behind a wall you don't notice until the whole ceiling sags. Keon rubbed his eyes and stood up, back to the floor. Santiago met him by the swinging kitchen doors, holding out a plate. "Table 10 again. They asked for you specifically." Keon took the plate and paused. "What did they want?" "Same order, but they said they forgot to tip last time and wanted to make it right." Keon raised an eyebrow. "That's a first." Santiago shrugged. "You're on a roll today." Back on the patio, Keon delivered the dish. The woman at table 10, a local real estate broker, handed him a folded bill and whispered, "You handled yourself with a lot more grace than I would have. Just so you know." He nodded. "Thank you. That means a lot." As he turned away, he noticed Astrid watching from her seat, one elbow propped lazily on the table, her expression unreadable. For a second he thought she might say something, but she just raised her glass and took a sip. In her mind, she was replaying that moment over and over, the smirk, the sarcasm, the translation, the silence. It had unraveled too fast for her to control. She kept telling herself it didn't matter, that she'd had worse PR moments, that this wasn't even being filmed, but something deeper was scratching at her. It wasn't just that Keon had made her look small, it was that he hadn't tried to. Later that night, after the last table cleared and the chairs were stacked, Keon walked the 10 blocks to his apartment in Avondale, his apron still folded in his backpack. He passed the same corner store where he bought coffee on weekdays, the mural on the side of the laundromat, the old gas station with the flickering open sign. He didn't feel triumphant. Not really. He felt grounded. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to shrink just because someone else expects you to. But while Keon was finally catching his breath, Astrid was already planning her next move. Monday morning came fast. Keon sat at his desk in the campus library, a worn Lenovo humming beside a stack of books on syntax theory. He had slept maybe 5 hours, but his mind was alert. His phone vibrated once, an email notification. Subject line, "Follow-up from brunch, Charleston." He clicked it open. It was from Dieter. "Keon, I meant what I said. Your insight was sharp, and your presence even sharper. I've already spoken to our Atlanta office. Let's set up a preliminary meeting this Friday, noon. It's informal, but it could lead to something bigger. Hope to see you there. Dieter Venskeon stared at the screen for a second before letting out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief. He reread it once. Then again. He didn't forward it. Didn't screenshot it. He just sat with it. Meanwhile, across town, Astrid Penbrook was in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Larkin building. A whiteboard covered in KPIs and migration flows stood behind her. But her mind wasn't on the quarterly pitch. She was scrolling through LinkedIn on her tablet. Keon Ridley. She had found him. Profile photo. Clean headshot. Plain background. Description. MA candidate. Computational linguistics. Clark Atlanta University. His work history included 3 research assistant positions, a fellowship from a non-profit tech incubator, and his current part-time job as service associate, Bel Air Club. Astrid read it twice, then checked his list of publications, then his GitHub. No fluff, no personal blog, just work. She reached for her phone and called Lillian Groves, her PR consultant. Lil, you got a second? For you? Always. I need you to do some background support on a potential hire. Name's Keon Ridley. Yeah, with a K. I want to make sure if this kid starts making waves, we're not blindsided. There was a pause on the line. Wait, is this about the brunch? Astrid didn't answer. Because Lila's been telling everyone about him, by the way. Lillian continued. Word's spreading fast. Some folks at Nova North think he's a natural speaker. There's talk he might get picked up for one of those startup pitch events. Astrid closed her eyes briefly. Just flag anything I should know, all right? Sure. But Astrid, Lillian added, whatever that was, you might want to consider letting it go. This might not be the headline you think it is. Astrid ended the call without replying. Back at the library, Keon responded to Dieter's email with a simple confirmation, then leaned back in his chair. Santiago had already texted him that morning. Let me know if I got to start calling you boss. It wasn't a job offer yet, but it was the kind of meeting that opened doors. And Keon had spent too long standing in hallways pretending not to knock. That afternoon, after his final seminar, Keon stopped at the Bel Air Club to pick up his check. The manager, Judith, caught him near the employee entrance. Keon, she said, her eyes warm. We've been hearing a lot, he braced himself. About, she smiled. About how you handled a difficult guest. I got 3 emails complimenting your professionalism. Never had that happen before. Keon raised an eyebrow. Really? Judith nodded. You made an impression. People are starting to talk about you in rooms you've never even stepped into. He thanked her, collected his check, and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The world didn't look different. Cars passed, people walked dogs, birds squawked overhead. But inside, something had shifted. He didn't feel like the guy bringing the latte anymore. He felt like the guy people would remember after they left the table. But not everyone was ready to let go of who they thought was supposed to be in charge, and that tension was just about to surface. Tuesday morning brought a cold front through Charleston, but Astrid Penbrook still showed up to a 9 a.m. panel discussion wearing a sleeveless navy sheath dress and a tailored coat thrown loosely over her shoulders. Her signature look. She was scheduled to speak on Adaptive Leadership in Tech, Scaling Smarter, Not Harder. It was meant to be another feather in her already crowded cap, but as she approached the reception table at the Charleston Convention Center, a volunteer handed her badge over with a neutral expression. Not the usual smile, not even the customary, "Thank you, Ms. Penbrook." Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet chatter. Her panel wasn't starting for another 30 minutes, but people had already gathered. Small talk drifted through the air, and somewhere near the coffee table, her name came up. That waiter guy. Keon something. Apparently he just got invited to consult with Vens Global. You're kidding. From the brunch? No, dead serious. Someone from Nova North's already asked about putting him on their radar. Astrid didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed slightly. She approached the stage area and set her materials down. The panel moderator, a woman named Charisse Linton from a cybersecurity firm in Phoenix, walked over to greet her. Morning, Astrid. Hey, Charisse. They shook hands. But something was off. Charisse's smile didn't reach her eyes. Astrid tried to cut through it. Long trip? Not too bad. Hey, just to let you know, there might be a question or two during the Q&A about that brunch story. Astrid blinked. Excuse me, you haven't seen it? Charisse said carefully. It's been floating on Twitter since last night. Somebody recorded the last part, where the guest corrected your Dutch. No one was recording. Well, they were, and the clip's got over 200k views already. Astrid's stomach dropped half an inch. I wouldn't worry, Charisse said quickly, though her tone didn't match. You can pivot. Just be aware. Astrid looked down at her phone. Dozens of notifications. Mentions. Emails. A few messages from investors, most with subject lines like, "Everything okay?" or "Saw the video." She opened one DM. Someone had clipped the moment when Keon gently corrected the phrasing on Dieter's note. No theatrics, just calm explanation. The tweet caption read, "When the waiter is the smartest guy at the table." The replies were brutal. That CEO really said, "Know your place" in 4K. Keon Ridley deserves a TED Talk. This is why you treat everyone with respect, because you never know who's sitting across from you. Astrid closed her phone. Hard. The panel went on as scheduled. She delivered her points with polish, with poise, but her words didn't land the way they usually did. The crowd was polite, but not responsive. The energy didn't crackle like it used to. After the panel, an older venture capitalist came up and shook her hand. "Good talk," he said. Then, after a pause, "But you know, we've all had our moments where we forget to look around before speaking. The smart ones learn from it." Astrid offered a smile, but it was tight. She thanked him and turned away before anyone could say more. Back in her hotel room, she dropped her bag on the bed and sat down without removing her heels. The city outside her window moved as if nothing had changed, but everything had. She wasn't cancelled, not in the dramatic, headline-making way people love to warn about. But she was diminished, and that, for someone like her, was worse. Across town, in a modest office near Clark Atlanta's main campus, Keon sat across from two reps from Venz Global's Atlanta division. They talked numbers, potential, contract terms. Nothing concrete yet. But all signs pointed to soon. He didn't brag. He didn't bring up what happened. He let his work speak. When he left the meeting, he walked past a billboard promoting a local business, his reflection caught for a moment in the glare of the glass. And for the first time in a long time, he saw a future that didn't include waiting for anyone's permission to be taken seriously. But for every door that opens, there's always someone still standing behind the one that just closed. And Astrid wasn't done staring at hers. 3 weeks passed. Quietly. No press releases, no public apologies, no headlines, just slow, deliberate shifts in conversation. Keon had started working remotely part-time with Venz Global. Nothing flashy, mostly back-end work, refining some of their machine learning models for multilingual search optimization. But the tone of every meeting he attended was different. People addressed him with real curiosity. They asked questions and waited for his input. They didn't assume he needed to be handheld or tested, and when he spoke, they listened. He hadn't left the Bel Air Club just yet. He didn't want to walk out like he was escaping something. No, he'd do it right. 2 weeks' notice, proper farewell. He'd promised Judith he'd train the new guy. That still mattered to him. One Wednesday morning, as he was prepping for a late shift, an email popped up in his inbox. A formal offer letter from Venz Global. Full-time. Hybrid position. Benefits. Starting salary almost triple what he'd made in the last year. He read it twice. Then stood up, walked to the window of his tiny apartment, and just let the silence settle. No cheering, no fist pump, just the quiet weight of a door that had finally opened wide enough for him to walk through without squeezing his shoulders. Down the road, in a glass-paneled office on the top floor of Nexora HQ, Astrid sat at her desk staring at the final draft of a blog post her PR team had ghost-written. Lessons in listening. Why true leadership starts with humility. Her face was unreadable as she scrolled through it. She didn't like how it sounded. Too polished. Too sanitized. But she also knew why they had written it. The story about the brunch hadn't gone viral in the typical sense. It hadn't trended, but it had traveled. Whispers at board meetings, subtle shade in interviews. One VC casually mentioned they were avoiding founders who forget that good ideas don't always come with a title. Another passed on a proposal she pitched, citing cultural tone concerns. No one said her name directly, but she knew. What really ate at her wasn't the fallout. It was the way she'd lost control of her image. She'd built a reputation on poise and precision, and all it took was a 2-minute exchange and a kid with wire-rimmed glasses to show people something she couldn't unshow. Astrid didn't hate Keon. Not exactly. She hated that he hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't embarrassed her on purpose. He hadn't used the moment to take a jab back. He'd just told the truth, and trusted that the truth could stand on its own. That was the part she couldn't spin. Back in Avondale, Keon turned in his apron that Friday. Judith gave him a small card signed by the team and a $50 gift certificate to a downtown restaurant he'd never been able to afford while working weekends. Santiago clapped him on the back and told him to buy a shirt with buttons for your new job, man. Keon smiled, hugged him, and promised to stay in touch. On his walk home, he passed the laundromat mural again. But this time, he stopped to look. It was a spray-painted portrait of a black jazz saxophonist, head tilted back, eyes closed mid-note. Someone had written above it in white paint, "They'll hear you even if they pretend not to." He stood there for a moment, just breathing. Later that evening, he opened his laptop, accepted the offer, and closed the tab without fanfare. Across town, Astrid sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blinking cursor in a blank email draft. She'd typed and deleted the same sentence 4 times. "Keon, I've been thinking a lot about what happened." She never finished it. Maybe she would one day, but for now, the lesson was hers to carry. But before you walk away from someone, maybe ask yourself, what would it cost you to treat them like they mattered? Because sometimes, the people we ignore become the ones we answer to. There are stories that end with applause, big moments, standing ovations, cameras flashing. Keon's story didn't need any of that. It ended the way real shifts do, quietly, with dignity. In rooms people didn't expect him to be in. At tables where no one had saved him a seat, but where his words made everyone stop and rethink who belonged. By the end of the month, Keon had moved into a shared townhouse closer to his new office. The place was nothing fancy, worn carpet, a bathroom that needed new tiles, but it had windows that let in good light and a view of the park where he liked to sit and read. He'd already started mentoring a few undergrads through a program at his old department. Some of them worked side jobs too, some in retail, some doing delivery, and he made sure they knew their value wasn't tied to the apron or name tag they wore. "Be ready," he told one student. "People will measure you by the wrong scale. Don't waste your time shrinking to fit it." Meanwhile, Astrid carried on. Nexora kept moving. She gave speeches, held investor calls, and posted polished photos of her latest tech summits. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But the way people looked at her had. Not always directly, but in meetings she noticed how some colleagues paused before laughing too quickly. How younger associates avoided volunteering thoughts when she was in the room. Not out of fear, but out of distance. Respect, once freely offered, now came slower. Conditional. Watched. That moment at brunch had not ruined her, but it had marked her. And sometimes being marked, quietly, is more lasting than being shouted down. One night, scrolling through LinkedIn on her couch, she saw Keon had updated his profile. Multilingual NLP analyst, Vens Global. She clicked the link, read the summary. Focused on bridging the gap between real people and the systems that serve them. Still learning, always listening. Astrid stared at the words. No bitterness, no sarcasm, no mention of her. He had moved on. She hadn't. And that, more than anything, was the real wound. Somewhere else, in a coffee shop near campus, Keon was helping a friend rehearse a research pitch for an upcoming tech conference. He wasn't presenting. He just liked being the guy who helped others shine. That had always been the plan. Show up, stay ready, stay real. He didn't care about revenge, he cared about progress. And sometimes the best kind of power isn't loud. It's the kind that doesn't flinch when someone tries to talk over you. The kind that stands steady when someone tests you in front of a crowd. Because no matter how smart someone thinks they are, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you show. And eventually, it's what decides who people follow and who they forget. So maybe next time you're at a table and someone delivers your coffee a little late, ask their name. Look them in the eye. Speak like they matter, because they just might be carrying more than a tray. Thanks for listening to the full story. If this moved you, if it made you pause for even a second, consider subscribing to the channel. We've got more real, human stories coming. Stories about dignity, grace, and the small moments that say everything. Until next time, treat people like they matter, even when no one's watching. Especially then.